World is made possible by grants from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and this station and other public television stations.
From the world's breadbasket, from Nebraska, in the heartland of America, a special report on Third World hunger and U.S. food aid. Good evening, I'm Jim Levy for World. In just over 25 years, our government has shipped $30 billion worth of food aid to hungrier countries, and the United States still provides more than half the world's food aid. But today, debate is raging among food aid specialists. Some are saying that food aid is doing nothing to help the hungry and may even be harming them. These critics even claim that no country benefits more from food aid than the main donor itself, the USA. The U.S. has a special relationship with the Third World. We send more food aid abroad than any other nation on earth. It's called Food for Peace and costs us more than $1 billion a year. Half our food aid is sold at concessional prices. The rest is given away by churches and charities. Individuals make their own contributions. Many farmers donate part of each year's crop for the hungry of the world. William Luby is one. His motive? Pure idealism.
We give it to them, and then it goes to the world's hungry and needy. We have the unique ability of producing an abundance of food in our nation here, and this is a great blessing for us, and we share that with other people who are not so fortunate.
Humanitarian concern is what most of us think our food aid is for. And when we think of food aid, we think of emergencies. The lives of these Somalian refugees depend on the food aid donated by the people of the United States of America. Everyone agrees that food aid will always be needed to cope with the suffering caused by this kind of crisis. But in fact, less than 10% of our food aid goes to emergencies. Emergency relief is only one of a variety of different food aid programs that we will examine. Food aid also includes the extensive supplementary feeding programs which aim to fight malnutrition in mothers and babies. Then there are food for work programs, which are intended to help development and self-reliance in developing countries. And finally, there is government-to-government food aid that is sold to friendly governments by the USA. The purpose of this documentary is to examine the growing criticism of all four kinds of food aid. It seems so obvious, doesn't it? If you want to help the hungry, you send them food. But if the food aid critics are right, those good intentions are misplaced. Now, before such claims are dismissed as sensational or irresponsible, we should point out that there is solid evidence for them. You can find it in many studies and documents, including the findings of the Presidential Commission on World Hunger, General Accounting Office reports to the Congress, in this confidential survey written for the World Council of Churches, and in unpublished documents and bitter letters of resignation from inside the Catholic Relief Service, the world's biggest relief agency. Now, of course, it would be naive to imagine that because something appears in print, it must be true. Well, we wanted to see if the arguments against food aid stand up to close examination, so we brought 5 experts here to discuss the issues. They came to this farm in Nebraska. These are the 2 most prominent and influential critics. Frances Moore LePay, author of Food First, has come here from San Francisco.
I think in most cases the cause of hunger is not scarcity. Hunger is a symptom of the powerlessness of people.
With her is Tony Jackson, an Englishman who has traveled the world working for the Anglo-American relief agency, Oxfam.
Scores of U.S. government and field worker reports show that the program simply isn't working.
These 3 defend food aid. Father Carlo Capone works for Catholic Relief Service. He has come here from Africa, where he is responsible for 1,000 projects serving 5 million people in 28 countries.
It can be a definite valuable resource for the improved nutrition and for the improved standard of living of the very poor.
Fred Wells actually administered American food aid programs when he worked for the USDA.
I guess I've always felt at least 51% of the program has done more good than harm, and so I've been willing to struggle with all the negative side of it without still concluding we ought to just disband the whole thing.
Dr. Mitchell Wallerstein, an author and professor at MIT, helps run the International Food and Nutrition Policy Program.
Some have argued that food aid does positive harm to the recipient populations and should be terminated. But I think that before going that far, one should ask, what does this actually mean in real terms?
Generally speaking, the program has been an almost total failure.
If you begin to dismantle the program, you may be left with no program at all.
And what is your view of why that would be bad?
It would be bad because what kind of impact would the withdrawal of aid have on the 400 to 500 million people who are currently estimated to be malnourished?
What we ask us as government is to give us all the food aid that we can manage.
The food aid provided, in my opinion, should always be directly related to something going on to develop the food and ag sector in that country. For no other reason than the fact that why is the country getting food aid to begin with? Why does it have the need for food aid?
I have to remind people that where food aid is presently going has nothing to do with the impact of that, with the need for it.
At the moment, it's basically out of control, feeding the wrong people in the wrong countries under the wrong programs.
The background to today's debate starts in Europe at the end of World War II. There were 20 million homeless people. Mass starvation was a real threat.
The homeless, hungry millions sent up a desperate cry for help. In America, the cry was answered by a multitude of relief groups. Their efforts were uncoordinated and sometimes ineffective.
But a poll taken then found that 82% of Americans were prepared to continue wartime rationing in order to feed the starving. Today, when Americans are polled, they don't even place world hunger in their top 20 areas of concern. The 1940s saw the creation of the great voluntary agencies Catholic Relief Service and CARE.
Basic food packages were developed. And another all-important element was added to overseas relief. CARE made it personal. This unique system of personal help was geared for relief on a massive scale. As the American public responded to appeals, the CARE package to Europe became a familiar part of the post-war scene.
Gentlemen, it's a pleasure to hand you this check for $1,500 for this food package for the starving in Europe. For American remittances to Europe, CARE, will supplement UNRWA and act as a means for the whole country to provide a hungry person in Europe with food enough for 3 or 4 weeks. I commend it to the people of the United States.
Food aid to Europe had a political purpose, too. General Marshall used to remind newsmen that food aid was preventing hungry workers from turning to communism.
The laborer must be provided with sufficient food so that he can produce and can subsequently earn the money to pay for that food. If we do that, we do not need to fear the efforts of the communist leaders.
The hungry were fed, the threat of human catastrophe averted. The food packages were no longer needed, but the emphasis of American food aid was about to change.
When we began operations in 1946, we did not have time to look beyond our immediate purpose, which was an emergency effort to relieve human suffering in post-war Europe and Japan. But by the time those areas in the world were on the road to recovery, the experience and expertise CARE had gained along the way was desperately needed in so many other places in the world. There was a veritable sea of human need. Hunger was taking the lives of millions of men, women, and most of all, children. Obtaining and delivering life-giving food to those desperate people was our first priority. We began negotiating large quantities of surplus food. In the United States, Public Law 480, the Food for Peace program, was initiated.
Public Law 480, passed in 1954, is the basis of American food aid to this day. It enables the government to buy up surplus food and either sell it abroad at concessional prices or give it away. But coping with human need has never been the only aim of PL 480.
What food aid is, as it has operated in the United States, is a combination of self-interest on our part as Americans with a constructive humanitarian effort in terms of helping others overseas. I well recall when the food assistance program was gathering force in the 1950s and early 1960s. The two things that drove that program were, first of all, the fact that we had what were then described as burdensome surpluses. That was a phrase you heard all the time. What are we going to do with $9 or $10 billion worth of agricultural surpluses that have accumulated at a cost of $1 million a day in storage charges, some of them going out of condition with the passage of time? So that was one factor. Supporting that was the shipping industry that benefited from the shipment of grain.
During the burdensome surpluses of the late 40s and early 50s, even homes and schools were pressed into service as temporary granaries. These surpluses threatened farmers with plummeting prices. The stated aims of Public Law 480 were to dispose of the surpluses and create new markets. To this day, food aid serves purposes that are not just humanitarian.
First of all, it is to promote market development for commercial agricultural exports. Secondly, it is to promote foreign policy interests in terms of helping recipient countries in terms of economic and political stability. And most important, I believe, it is to help food deficit countries feed its people.
Well, I don't think there's anyone who knows any of the history of food aid who would claim that the motives were primarily humanitarian. Although I do believe that in the eyes of the American people, that it has always been that.
Clearly, without the strong backing and, in fact, initiation of the farm lobby, there would have been no PL 480 program. And if one looks at the original objectives of the program, clearly that reflects that orientation. In fact, it wasn't until 1959 that the term food for peace came into existence, largely at the initiative of Hubert Humphrey. And it was at that time that you began to see the first even halfway serious attention to non-market development activities, that is humanitarian and at least ostensible interest in development.
So I think it had a mix of objectives right from the start, although I think the economic one was the overriding objective. Unfortunately, the surplus disposal did not go far enough, and that it just took the food away from the United States, but did not recognize the negative impact it would have on the recipient.
From the earliest days, people realized the dangers of creating a global soup kitchen. Food aid planners stressed the need for development and self-help to eradicate the root causes of hunger. Yet in many cases, the vast amounts of American food aid being sold cheap or given away actually impeded development. Even the most dedicated defenders of food aid concede this danger.
A country like India in the 1950s and early 60s would have lost probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people to hunger and starvation had it not been for the U.S. Food Assistance Program. On the other hand, one has to recognize that in some cases where we got a little bit overzealous, our food helped to drive down the prices of local grain. Now that means that in a country like Burma, which was a rice-producing country, or Pakistan, or what have you, that the import of American food assistance was viewed by the local farmers as something that broke their own domestic market price, just as flooding the American market with cheap goods would do that here.
In this drive to create markets, American food aid officials set out to change the world's tastes. School feeding programs, set up in scores of countries, were designed to teach children to acquire an appetite for American food, especially bread.
One of the reasons behind the growing taste for bread in Japan is the school lunch program that was set up with American help. The benefit to our wheat sales in Japan is obvious. The youngsters are acquiring a taste for bread and bakery products that they will have throughout their lives.
In this way, whole nations acquired the taste for American grain. After accepting American food aid, Colombia's wheat production declined by 69%, while imports climbed 800%. Food for Peace has donated these sacks of grain to the United Nations World Food Program. The grain is being turned into animal feed. Even today, free gifts like this are being used to create markets. Officials have been encouraging Mario Perez and other peasant farmers to raise more chickens and livestock. But the feed the animals consume will have been made from grain grown in America. So the peasants who eat these pigs will be indirect customers of the USA.
One of my concerns in studying the impact of food aid as a market development strategy is that it has led cultures to shift from, in Asia, a rice-based diet to a diet more and more dependent on wheat. And we have actively taught people how to cook with wheat. We set up bakery schools, etc., to try to induce people to shift from a basic rice diet, which they themselves can produce, given their local climatic conditions, to wheat, which they cannot in many cases.
I think that anyone who has examined the issue would be inclined to agree with you that where that kind of taste change diverts resources away from the production of crops which are climatically suited to a particular area and which are within the effective economic demand of the poor, this is not a good thing, particularly for countries that are seriously deficient in protein and calories.
Another aspect, of course, of our market development has been shifting people toward a grain-fed meat diet. Here again, it's a shifting toward a way of eating that is not sustainable using local resources. There's no way in the world that the world can support a grain-fed meat diet for the majority of its people. What are the long-term consequences? That is a very profound change that we have wrought in a people's culture. We have made people dependent on us.
Food aid has played its part in creating a $47 billion world market for American farmers. Food for Peace still has commercial aims, but now more emphasis is put on humanitarianism. As we've already seen, food aid is used in emergencies, in supplementary feeding programs, in food for work projects, and as a subsidy to friendly governments. Yet, it is precisely these uses of food aid that come in for some of the sharpest criticisms today. When most of us think of food aid, we think of emergency relief operations. We're deeply moved when we see victims of famine, war, earthquake, typhoon, drought, and flood. These tragedies have become cliches of the news business. Everyone agrees that emergency food aid will always be needed for disasters. But in some circumstances, it can harm the very countries it is meant to help. This is Biafra in 1968. Several emergency food centers have been set up by the Red Cross. There are 8,000 people at this one, which is only 5 miles from the front line. The news media have been reporting mass starvation in the jungles of Biafra. Food has been rushed in to save the lives of starving mothers and their pathetic babies. But these pictures, found in the United Nations Film Archives, suggest that most of the people at this same feeding center are not starving at all. A former relief worker in Biafra, who has since become a government advisor on emergency operations, is Fred Cuney.
What we've found is that in the supplementary feeding, which is really one of the keys to a nutrition program in disasters, is that the healthy people are the ones who come in. Because if you have a center that's set up to feed the people, people have to walk to the center, have to get processed and get in line and so forth. By that, the natural selection process takes place, that those who are the healthiest go to the centers. It requires an outreach program to go to the area to make sure that the people who really need it get it. You will find, with any large influx of refugees, some people who are being carried and brought in. Those can be treated through your therapeutic or your intensive feeding programs. But there will always be in the minority of people who are being treated. So what we found is that the feeding programs that are operated in many disasters don't have any effect whatsoever on the death rate. They may have an effect that you can't see in preventing more deaths, but they rarely get to the people who are the most vulnerable and prevent them from dying.
According to Cooney, the lessons of Biafra were soon forgotten. A few years later, the same mistakes were repeated in another part of Africa, this time with more far-reaching consequences. This is the Sahel. It is the region of Africa just south of the Sahara Desert. Its semi-nomadic people raised cattle here and tilled the few acres of fertile soil until a terrible drought struck.
To save lives, a massive international relief effort has been mounted. More than 3 billion pounds of grain have been shipped in from all over the world. The United States has been the largest individual donor through the Agency for International Development, which administers U.S. foreign economic assistance, and through the generosity of thousands of concerned Americans. They have provided help through volunteer agencies, schools, civic and religious groups, and with individual contributions.
As in Biafra, emergency food aid was taken to large feeding centers. But according to Fred Cuny, this meant that the people who came for it had to abandon the farming areas.
If you walk for half a day to get the food and have to walk half a day back, and the next morning have to turn around and come back one more time, you're out of the production. And therefore, you're contributing to a long-term problem. And we contributed to a large extent, I believe, to the hunger in the area. This isn't unusual. The same type of thing happens, and it's the very essence of the food aid question. There are cases when food aid is going to be necessary. The question is, how do you distribute it in such a way that you don't create a disincentive to or a perpetuation of the situation you're trying to eradicate?
When it draws farmers off the land, emergency food aid can undermine local production. Fred Cuny says the Sahel is no exception. It's 1976. Emergency food aid is being loaded onto planes chartered by America's Catholic Relief Service. A terrible earthquake has struck Guatemala. 25,000 people have been killed, and 250,000 have no homes. As well as emergency food aid, the Catholic Relief Service has rushed in quantities of much-needed medicine, clothes, blankets, and building materials. The peasants did need new roofs, but because that year Guatemala had just enjoyed a bumper harvest, the agency's extensive use of food aid has been much criticized.
Nutrition development is important to CRS in Guatemala. A positive result of the quake has been the forced expansion of this type of project to communities previously unreached. El Subinal is one of these.
What this film does not describe is how the scale of these handouts forced the government of Guatemala to pass a decree banning the import of any more emergency food aid.
I was in Guatemala before and after the earthquake in 1976. I asked two farmers, small farmers, peasant farmers, about how did they know that the market had gone down because of the food aid. And they said right out, because we went to villages where we always sell food and they weren't buying since they'd be given it for free.
If there are other parts of the country that have excess food, it should be bought locally first.
Food still wasn't needed, but if you'd wanted to buy it, you could have bought it locally.
But now would that be then to conclude to just don't provide food aid during emergencies, or to provide it under different arrangements?
It's a country by country and a disaster by disaster.
Your example now is not an example of an emergency. That country didn't have a crop failure because it had plenty of food. So it doesn't apply.
That is exactly the point, Father. Why do the agencies do it? Why do the food aid agencies do it? That's the question.
Well, I think it's this humanitarian concern which gets misguided so often. And we have to be careful about this. You just can't react from the heart all the time. You have to...
It seems like a lot of these issues are logistical and management issues, too. And clearly there's an element of knee-jerkism here. And the fact that the voluntary agencies are so often the ones that are on the ground, that have the management infrastructure in place, and it just so happens that what they do is deliver food.
But the food aid didn't help. All that year, the food aid went in. And what was, to my mind, most interesting and most significant was that the field workers, the care guy, the Catholic Relief Services and Caritas people, the Oxfamites, the World Neighbors, all of us knew and told our officers food aid wasn't needed. But Guatemala City, and particularly New York, insisted on sending it in.
Too often the need isn't assessed immediately after the emergency. They simply dump in tons and tons of food.
Everybody keeps raising there's an emergency to generate quick public support to get more food in.
I think we'd all be in favor of food aid when food crops have been destroyed in the area. No one is arguing that it isn't necessary. However, there have been so many examples of food aid going in either too late or when it positively wasn't needed because there had been a type of disaster that much more attention needs to be paid to what the Dickens were doing out there when we sent disaster food aid in.
Famine and mass starvation caused by war or natural calamity aren't the major hunger problems in the world today. The real hunger problem of our time is chronic undernutrition. Millions of men, women, and children simply don't get enough to eat, and this is what most food aid is meant for. Though it rarely makes the headlines, constant hunger is an everyday fact of life for 800 million of our poorest fellow humans. The ravages of malnutrition affect children worst in their first 2 years. It stunts their growth and damages their brains. Even after that, their weakened state makes them easy prey to disease. Naturally, children feature heavily in the relief agency's fundraising efforts. A quarter of all American food aid goes to supplementary feeding programs for children. While CARE runs successful school feeding programs all over the world, other schemes have been criticized. Most of the food handled by the United Nations World Food Program is donated by the USA. Officials here concentrate much of their food aid on nursing mothers and babies.
Colombia's Institute of Family Welfare sponsors a supplementary feeding scheme for expectant and nursing mothers. Each time Barbara comes for her food, the action the World Food Program incentive provides is physically measured. The scales tell her the child is growing and prospering on the new diet. And each time she comes, Barbara and the other mothers get another lesson in nutrition from the community worker. Barbara is learning that a far too often fatal relationship exists between malnutrition and the health of her child. She also gets another lesson, this one right in the breadbasket: how to get better meals from this gift from the World Food Program.
The experience of numerous field workers shows that poor mothers like Barbara Osorio with more than one mouth to feed are likely to divide the food gift among the whole family. In this way, the food fails to reach the baby. Elsewhere, there are other reasons for failure. Like many developing countries, the beauty of the Dominican Republic and the lush variety of its vegetation provide a cruel contrast to the poverty of its people. A survey of 6 mother-child health clinics was carried out here. After it, 37 mothers wrote to the relief agency asking it to stop sending food aid for their children. What the survey found was that the children's weights actually improved when the supplementary feeding was stopped. A separate study carried out in Jamaica reached a similar conclusion.
Well, I was in the Caribbean, where I came across a program which had been feeding about 5,000 children. It was one of your agency's programs. And the nutritionist had done a study. She found that the children's weights went up at 3 times of the year. Avocado time, mango season, and whenever the food aid stopped. So she began to question the mothers. And they said, well, whenever you don't give us the food aid, we just feed our child the natural foods that we have here already available. But when you're given the food aid, when the wonder food comes in, we stop giving them the regular food. And that was why their weights were going down. She decided to do what I'm advocating. She stopped food aid. Just cut it right out. All U.S. food aid.
The voluntary agencies have been remiss, as USAID and some of the other bilateral aid agencies, in not being able to recognize when the point is reached when they must phase out. And here I think that the accusation can be made fairly that it's a question of the self-serving nature of the programs, that there is a desire to perpetuate what one is doing and not to diminish the organization's involvement in a particular country setting.
Well, that's the impression that observers have from this part of the world, In my experience, in our experience, it's not a question of phasing out. We haven't phased in yet. And the reason why you don't get nutritional or mental results, the main reason is because the food package is too small. That doesn't work because it's too small.
Doesn't work.
When in Africa we were giving only $3 of extra food a month to a family with a malnourished child. That's all what we could scrap.
Why were you doing it? Yeah, you agree with me then, we should scrap it.
No, we should improve. From 3 I want 30, and there is a possibility. Why should we scrap the $3? When there's a possibility from $3 to make 30.
Except we seem to have established that there is no measurable nutritional impact. That if anything...
$3 package.
Well, from any package.
No, from a $3 package, there is nutritional impact and how.
You yourself wrote an article, I think it was published last year, in which you said, can supplementary feeding, along with the development process, answer the malnutrition problem? One would like to say yes, but experience and extensive studies on the subject say that the answer is no.
I've been involved in food aid programs for over 20 years. And during this time, I formulated the opinion that food aid is a powerful tool for the improvement of nutritional status and of the standard of living of the very poor of the developing countries.
There's no nutritional impact in general, no long-term development for the poor. In fact, very often the poor are worse off after the program than they were before. The school feeding side is feeding exactly the wrong children, since the poor generally don't go to school. So I think now is a time to cut right back on this type of food aid and to use food when it really is needed for refugees and for emergencies.
Emergency food aid and supplementary feeding programs can never by themselves eliminate the root causes of world hunger. In the long run, hunger will only be overcome when the poor countries have the opportunity to develop. Many food aid schemes are now designed to help create self-reliance in third world countries. The most widespread use of food aid as a developmental tool is found in the numerous Food for Work programs. This project in Haiti was organized by the USAID agency. In Food for Work schemes, food is used to pay gangs of landless peasants and unemployed laborers instead of cash. In this way, food aid is supposed to contribute directly to the country's development. The voluntary agencies, Catholic Relief Service and CARE, have been running Food for Work programs of their own for years.
This road is being built in Ecuador. The workers' garments reflect the bright colors of their country. Here, a serenade is considered an essential part of the day's work. The topography may vary, but the idea is the same. CARE Food provides partial payment to the workers. This unique system of putting CARE Food to work in self-help programs has met with great success all over the world in a wide variety of projects.
Critics believe that much of the energy spent on Food for Work goes to waste. When a dam building project was surveyed here in Botswana, it was found that the workers took 25 times longer to finish the job than workers paid with cash. Generally speaking, the workers say they would rather be paid with money than food. That may be one reason why the food they are given so often finds its way onto the black market. Another problem with food as a means of payment, and with food aid in general, is that it has a distressing habit of falling off the back of a truck, as the saying goes. This UN film acknowledges the problem.
At Letla Keng, the storeroom at the village police station has become a relief food store. Storage was always a major problem, and especially in the districts, often had to be improvised. Food must be protected from weather, pests, and pilferers.
A high UN official who recently retired has written that the scale of pilfering is so vast that it is undermining development efforts in all the 26 African countries he had worked in. In their food aid budgets, some UN personnel unofficially allowed 20% for leakage, a bureaucratic euphemism for theft. The biggest food for work projects anywhere are to be found in Bangladesh, where all these problems occur in their most pronounced form, despite the upbeat tone of this USAID film.
Abdul shifts his weight and adjusts the 40 or more pounds of alluvial clay balanced on his straw head pad. Then, with a determination born of need, quickly disappears into a legion of his countrymen. By the end of the day, he will have moved more than a ton of earth. For every 4 or 5 tons he moves, he'll be paid in grain, about 62 pounds, enough to keep him and his small family alive.
It's a massive program. There's something like 150,000 tons of wheat going in for the Food for Work at the moment. Of that, according to US government statistics, at least 30% is disappearing. There is massive misappropriation. It's such a vast program, no one can control it. Statistics from Oxfam, from a small study, showed that 75% wasn't reaching the people we're trying to feed. Let's say 50% will be a reasonable amount of food not reaching the people. So even on our first aim, which is to feed hungry people in possibly the hungriest country in the world, we're failing by around 50%. I think that's quite appalling.
I guess a point that could be made in rebuttal to that, though, Tony, is the fact that nothing that I heard you just say is inherent in the nature of Food for Work as a concept. That what you're really referring to are management failures, logistical problems, and the omnipresent human dilemma of greed and corruption.
The evidence from Bangladesh is that the landowners end up getting free labor on their land, paid for in US government wheat, while the poor get the food. So the poor get a little food, and the rich get quite a lot richer from the benefits brought to the land.
Again, therefore, I don't think that the indictment should be made necessarily of Food for Work, but of the inability of the governments, or in some cases the external agencies that are involved, to effectively manage the programs. There are, in fact, examples, although I must admit they are few, where Food for Work has functioned effectively.
What do you think, Paul?
Well, first I want to back up what he said, that you are talking about failures of management now in food aid, and other complications that may happen may prevent food aid to become effective.
You said that there were some positive examples there. Well, my colleague interviewed one of the officials in the Planning Commission who did a study on food aid, which came out very, very positive. And yet in a private interview, he said that report was censored, and that what his real conclusion is that Food for Work programs' overriding impact is to consolidate rural assets into the elite's hands, and that is a long-term impact. So I think even some of these studies which come out with fairly positive results might not give a true assessment.
One example, there's a place in the one US study called